That's what your job is.
You got your candy.
Hey, Tim, didn't even need to get. We now call this workshop of the City of Fort Walton Beach and the City Council to order. Good afternoon to everyone. If you'll please stand if you're able and join us for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you all very much for that. If you do have an electronic device, please make sure that it is switched on silent, turned off, or thrown out the door. We will now begin our discussion on the downtown design guidelines, and this workshop will commence with words from the wonderful Christopher Frasetti.
Thank you, Mayor and Council. Appreciate everyone's time this afternoon prior to the regular meeting to go over this item. So we're excited to be at this stage of the process, and we do have our consultant here, Allie from Kimley Horn, to be able to go through a presentation with you guys. Really, the purpose of this, we attached a presentation and a final draft, and I wanted to make that clear, and that in this fact, it is a draft and it's something we're working on, looking for input. As we'll get into with Allie, this process started last summer. We had some stakeholder meetings, community charrettes. We did an online survey. We got feedback from, I think in person, well over 100 people, plus community survey, I think close to 100 folks. So, kind of the steps in that process is when we kicked it off. We got a lot of those public input sessions, and we did some one-on-one meetings as well over the starting last summer, but then into the fall and winter. Really got going with it, and then between me and my team, we worked with Kimley Horn to kind of develop these different draft documents and guidelines to where we are today, and we're excited to kind of show it to you, get your all input here, go from there and see where we can go. So with that, I will turn it over to Allie, and we'll get into the presentation, and happy to answer any questions and kind of work through this process and do the good things. So thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Good evening. I'm back. I know there's some new folks here tonight that weren't here during the last meeting, so we are going to do a bit of a refresher in the presentation, so I'll try not to put you to sleep, but I thought that was important to kind of go through some of the things that we haven't talked about for quite a few months now. So Allie Palmer with Kimley Horn. I sit in Tallahassee, and I lead the community planning department. So we're here to talk about the downtown design guidelines, and I just first want to say that working with your staff has been a pleasure. I would be remiss if I didn't say that they are some of my favorite clients to work with, and they know that, Tim, Chris, and Elisa. They are just amazing people, and I thank you all for having them here. So, okay, let me get this to, where am I pointing this? There we go. Okay, so just a quick agenda. We are going to talk about some of the things, as I mentioned, that we reviewed in our earlier workshop, such as existing conditions, our plan and policy review. Also, how Chris mentioned that we did a lot of public engagement, so kind of wanted to recap that for anybody who wasn't part of that. We'll talk about some of the stakeholder meetings, survey, all that good stuff, and then we'll get into the beef of the design guidelines, and then talk about next steps. I'm going the wrong way. Okay, so just design guidelines in general. What's the goal? Why are we doing them? Really, it's to improve or maintain the sense of place in downtown Fort Walton Beach. We do that by improving the visitor experience, maintaining existing successful businesses, attracting new businesses, we hope, better connecting residents to downtown, and emphasizing and preserving history, especially here in Fort Walton. You all have a lot of that, and that's important. So with that, there's many things that design guidelines can include. We can look at a lot of different factions of design elements downtown, in downtowns, to have impacts on those types of things. And you'll see as we go through the presentation that we kind of have broken those up in public realm versus private realm, because there's things that we, the city, can be doing. There's things that we can be doing in the short term versus the long term. And then there's things that we can be encouraging private property owners to do in the private realm. And so it's kind of a cross-section of all those different types of things. Just realized my volume's not down on my computer, so let me do that. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, so this is just a quick overview of the blue dotted line, which is the CRA boundary, for just as a refresher for anybody in the room who doesn't know where that is. And then the purple shaded area is the Downtown Design Overlay District. So they are somewhat overlapping. And so just for this particular project, we specifically concentrated in that purple area, so specifically in the downtown district. And then again, just as sort of a little reminder, as far as the downtown district is concerned, in previous studies and plans, you all had essentially determined that there was different sub-districts of the downtown, and these are those sub-districts. And so as part of these areas, we were looking at, and this was actually from the study, obviously, that showed the reconfiguration of the roadway as well, but this is ultimately what would be those possible future districts and with that road reconfiguration. So as far as our existing conditions, which again took place about last spring, I guess it was, some of the things that we noticed looking at these maps and walking around downtown and also just talking with folks, there were several things that we noticed, and you'll see in the report there's a lot more things than just these 10 that are listed, but these are the ones that we felt were important to discuss today. So as you all probably know, there are multiple small parcels downtown, and they're under, for the most part, very many different ownerships. So in other words, it's not an area of land where you have one huge parcel under one ownership where you can kind of work from a blank slate, right? So we're dealing with lots of different people, lots of different parcels. Some are built, some are vacant, some are in the middle of redevelopment. And that's just important to consider when you're looking at design regulations, guidelines. Another noteworthy aspect of the existing conditions is you all have a lot of historic assets, which is amazing, and that's something you should celebrate. And so we wanted to make sure that was brought front and center as part of our efforts. The built form, you're very lucky. You have an existing grid system here. You have buildings that actually already address the street. So you have something to kind of build off of. Those are things that many other cities would love to have in their communities and don't always have that, even in historic downtowns. You have a secondary main street. So you have a main street, but then you also have Brook Street. And so you have two really wonderful assets there as far as being able to provide frontages for your businesses and activating the ground floors. So you have lots of things that are working already in downtown, which I know you're aware of. You have pedestrian connectivity. People already like to walk downtown. Can we make it better? Maybe, but that's already happening, especially during events and when things are happening down there. You are on the water, you have waterfront access. That again is just something that not a lot of main streets, not a lot of downtowns have access to, and that's literally in the backyard of the Fort Walton Beach downtown. You have a diverse collection of retail and service operators, and you also have an eclectic architectural style. So you have many different types of architectural style, which we always look as being a positive downtown because that creates that sense of place, once again, that we're really looking for. Okay, so beyond our existing conditions study, we wanted to talk a little bit about what we did last summer, as Chris talked about. We started in June, where we had a community charrette. We had about 70, probably, I think you said 100, but 70 signed in, let's put it that way. And at that meeting, I know some of you were there, I remember Gloria, of course, and we talked about a lot of things. We did a community values survey, and then we broke out into different stations and had folks talking about what their vision was for downtown Fort Walton Beach. And that was a lot of fun. Then we had our CRA stakeholder meeting, and that was held in July. And so we had about 25 or so attendees at that particular meeting. And we started getting a little bit more into the details there, right? Started hearing very specific themes about parks and open space, streets and roadways, what they want Main Street to look like, what they want the buildings and architecture to look like. And some of the things we heard from that were they want places to rest, places where they can sit with their families or their friends, connecting with the waterfront. Local character was a big one. That was very, very important. That kept on coming up. And again, just sort of linking back to that sense of place. Outdoor spaces for businesses. So in other words, places where businesses can function not only within the walls of their retail space, but also outside as well. And then of course, preserving historic buildings and really activating the frontages again on those two, what we call the first primary and secondary main streets of the downtown. We also had a survey that was open throughout the entire public engagement timeframe. And by the way, there were a few more meetings that were held during this period of time that we just didn't feel was necessary to speak on every single meeting today, but we do summarize them in the report and in the presentation. But as far as the survey goes, we had over 80 respondents, which was fairly successful in our eyes as far as public engagement surveys for this type of effort. So that was great, really active community, especially when it's for a confined area like just a downtown. So that was exciting. And so some of the things that we heard, again, a lot of reoccurring themes that we had heard in the survey was really to, connecting to those existing open spaces, connecting to the water, connecting to the waterway, to the park that you all are about to improve. The desire for more green spaces, more pocket parks per se, linear spaces that could be used for gatherings or events, things of that nature. As far as streets and roadways, really encouraging keeping the buildings closer to the streets. So in other words, if something was to redevelopment, nobody wants to see a swath of parking in front of that building, right? They like the fact that there is on-street parking, parking in the rear, other places, maybe public parking, wide sidewalks. That was something we heard quite often, and just again providing that connectivity between the neighborhoods and downtown, being able to walk, bring their strollers, golf carts, whatever it may be, not using cars but getting here in alternative ways. As far as Main Street, most respondents recognize the potential of downtown, right? Everybody's excited about it, and that was really, we love hearing that from residents. That's where you have your champions, right? You want to hear from those business owners and those residents to make sure, because after this, you can create this document, you need somebody to keep on moving forward with it. And so there was a lot of excitement in that respect, and support for the unique character and that sense of place downtown. As far as buildings and architecture, we had, I think it's nearly, 80% of the respondents believe that historic buildings were valuable and that they need to, of course, be maintained and honored, whatever the history is behind those buildings. And as far as other assets, the mound and other things that are happening downtown from a historic preservation perspective. And then, of course, encouraging active uses that maintain the feel of downtown. So I'm not going to go through all of these, but once we received all the feedback from our online engagement and all of our in-person meetings, we sort of just looked at this as, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. We put all that together in these 4 baskets and came up with what we really felt were the reoccurring themes, what were important to be considered during the development of these design guidelines. And so from that exercise, we started identifying goals. What were the goals for the design guidelines based on the data and based on the public input? And so you'll see in the actual design guideline document, these goals are articulated on one of the first few pages as far as what we felt were going to be important to the community and to you in the development of these guidelines. So this includes developing a modern and vibrant urban atmosphere to attract residents and tourists alike to the downtown area, emphasizing the historical charm of downtown through the preservation of historic structures and complementary architectural designs, promoting character-rich placemaking with new developments that are human-scaled and context-sensitive, cultivating a network of district public spaces to provide for a sense of welcoming and belonging, creating a distinct identity and unique sense of place downtown, fostering a pleasant, engaging, and diverse pedestrian experience, and maintaining and promoting effective multimodal circulation. Sorry, I'm reading off the screen, but I felt like those are really important to read out loud, and especially if anybody's listening at home.
Yes, sir. I say we can fire them off now. Go for it.
Okay. Feedback on that, Mr. Mayor, send this out to whoever needs to. That last statement that you read, the goals, what was that last couple sentences?
Maintain and promote effective multimodal circulation.
And then before that, protect and maintain kind of the welcoming,
Foster a pleasant, engaging, and diverse pedestrian experience.
there you go. Mr. Mayor, how is, this possible legislation, I think it's SB 160?
180.
180, thank you. That with us creating these things that we all, I think, can get on board with of wanting that nurturing and welcoming environment, are we going to be able to plan to preserve and to try to go after that environment that she is recommending?
I would approach this meeting in any macro decisions you make today, because they will be macro decisions for the most part at this meeting, as if SB 180 does not exist, because staff would still have to come back to you at a later point in time if an LDC change was ever to be made. And by the time that gets around, we'll know if SB 180 has been signed into law and have a good idea really how it would maybe impact what you're trying to do. So I would act like this is not going to be signed today and kind of exist in that world.
Gotcha, thank you. And thanks for the clarification on SB. You said 180, right? Not 160. All right, thank you.
Mr. Presetti, you want to add to that?
If I may add,
Please.
also on that too, in some of the next steps, we've talked about ways that we can implement this. Part of this, half of the plan is really the public sector stuff for us as a community city to do. The other half is the private side, but we talked about doing it as an incentive with our CRA grants in ways that it's not regulatory necessarily, that goes into our code, but it's something that we can help encourage and promote, through CRA grants and things like that, I think can also not be affected by SB 180.
Gotcha. Awesome. And that was really it, just concerned about, we all want this stuff, but currently the way the LDC reads, things like gas stations and other things can be developed in this master plan that we're all trying to get to or wanting to get to, but if we can't
100%.
plan to protect that environment or get to that environment, it's going to be hard to access this. But
100%, yeah, that was one of the things with it that we were, working through it and saying, one of the concerns is, hey, we're spending all this time, effort, money, everything, but if we're not going to, enforce it or use it, what's the purpose? What's the point of doing this exercise here? But then, we talked about, well, there's the, there's the incentive side and there's the regulation side, and if we start with the incentive side, we can see how that goes. We can see how SB 180 goes, and then
track.
Have that opportunity in the future as well. We can then maybe put it in for as a requirement for future development.
Tracking, that's very helpful. Thank you, Mr. Rossetti. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Ms. Palmer, can I ask you just one question as well?
Yeah.
And I think this is just maybe a breakdown in my own brain trying to process what these words mean. But one of the bullet points reads, promote character-rich placemaking with new developments that are human-scaled and context-sensitive. I honestly don't understand what that means.
It's plannerese, first of all, so
Well, I
don't
kinda
worry.
figured that. I just wanted you to dumb it down a bit.
I'm going to be completely transparent here.
Okay, good.
Right. So first of all, that sentence I will say is definitely, the first part is the most important, because this is when we're talking about if there was, for instance, a parcel that was going to be completely redeveloped or a vacant parcel, which I know are few and far between, but and so the effort is to ensure that there are values there, right? And so when we're going to go through some of the more detail of what that means, but that there are going to be things that are expected of new development to be consistent and in sync with what is already happening and what has occurred over time within downtown Fort Walton Beach.
Okay.
We can probably clarify that a little bit if you like.
Thank you.
No.
Please continue. I'm sorry for the
No problem.
interruption.
Okay, so we've made it to the actual guidelines. So this is when things start getting fun. The first thing that we kind of wanted to talk about, I mentioned this a little bit earlier, is one of the things that we worked on with staff is sort of, okay, we've heard all these things, we know that all this stuff needs to be addressed, but how do we sort of divide and conquer as far as things that, as Chris mentioned, could be done, on your side as far as the city making improvements and looking at things that can be done in the public realm versus things that we're going to be encouraging or incentivizing in the private realm. And so we ended up actually dividing the guidelines into those two categories, just so from a user guide, this was as simple as possible. If you're coming in to develop in Fort Walton, you're going to be looking at the private realm. However, this book was not just for the private, it's also for the city and for the public. So we wanted to make sure that there was a very good divide as to where those different kind of components are coming from and the ease of use of the document. So I have broken out these slides as best I can without being here for 3 hours. So we're going to summarize a lot of it. If you all have any questions, obviously at the end, I'm happy to chat more about it. But we are going to cover public realm first. And so one of the very first things that we talk about in public realm is going back to the master plan, right? And this is consistent with that, but we wanted to sort of reiterate some of the things that were sort of spoken about at this level, the very high level in the master plan, but weren't necessarily given what we call teeth. And so one of the things that we really wanted to bring up to that front level in the public realm was block configuration. A lot of that already exists, and so again, that is one of the wonderful advantages of the existing configuration of downtown right now is the grid system. However, we just want to make sure that doesn't go away, right? And so we want to look at providing walkable blocks. That's the whole benefit of main streets and downtowns, is making sure we keep them walkable. And to do that, sort of a best practice is to keep your blocks within 300 to 500 feet in length. And so that is one of the first things that we talk about in the design guidelines. And again, the main reason for that is to ensure that it's maintains that walkability through your downtown. And so we are going to encourage that through the maximum of about 500-foot block. We're going to encourage interior pedestrian cut-throughs. We're going to divert any sort of curb cuts along your main streets to make sure that folks aren't having to walk across too many driveways at once, things of that nature. Again, just sort of keeping that in a place where people feel comfortable walking and safe walking downtown. The next thing that we talk about, which is obviously fairly related, is the pedestrian realm within the block, within the street. And so this area spans from the back of the curb to the building facade. And it's really divided into 4 zones. You have your sidewalk zone, your street furnishing zone, your planting zone, and then your building transition zone, which is essentially where the public realm meets the private realm, or the property line, essentially is what that is. And so one of the big takeaways here is that we want to keep all of these zones what we call human scaled. Again, just going back to making sure that it's for the pedestrian, for the bicyclist, for the person that is essentially trying to enjoy your downtown area. So in the sidewalk zone, these are some of the renderings, and again, they're all in the booklet, so you can look at more of the details within the actual guideline booklet. But some of the things to note in the sidewalk zone are the paved linear spaces where pedestrians are going to be able to travel, and the whole point of that is so people can pass by each other. You don't have to essentially be in a single file line. And that there is space to move. People can be going back and forth with a stroller, with a walker, with a wheelchair, whatever it might be. There's going to be space for travel in that sidewalk zone for clear, continuous, and circulation. The next zone that we talked about is the street furnishing zone, or in this case, street furnishings and outdoor furniture zone. I think we combined this one. And so the effort here was to really identify enhanced pedestrian and cyclist comfort by providing opportunities to rest and relax in that pedestrian zone. So if you're walking a lot, you might want to sit for a moment or just look at things around you. So we have provided essentially a library of benches and seating that would be appropriate in this area. Again, these are all just examples of what could be there. Nothing is like something that you absolutely have to use, but just from a visual perspective, what would be helpful to be located in this particular zone. There's also trash receptacles, bike racks. Another thing that I forgot to mention in the beginning of this, but presentation, we definitely also looked at, from a safety perspective, what we could be identifying as part of your already occurring CEPTED program. And so we made sure that when we were looking at these guidelines, that we were essentially identifying what was also part of that environmental design through crime prevention, what we could be identifying as part of that program as well. And so in this particular zone, obviously lighting is a big part of that, making sure that the sidewalks are lit, especially in the evening hours, and people are still feeling safe and comfortable in that zone. Okay, the next zone is the planting zone. So of course, we love our shade in Florida. We need it. Otherwise, you will not see anybody on those sidewalks between the months of May and October. So plants are important to provide that shade. So we've identified areas for tree wells, garden beds, planter pots, all things that will provide both shade, but also provide just a softer, more human-scaled, again, environment in that walking area. And that's going to, of course, result in things like buffering, a nicer aesthetic. It'll also help improve water quality and habitat within the downtown area. And then lastly, this is the building transition zone. So this, again, is located directly adjacent to the building where the private and public realms sort of meet. It serves as a buffer and refuge for pedestrians. It provides space for window shoppers away from traffic in the sidewalk zone. And it should really be complementary to whatever you all have decided to put into your streetscape. And it should also be sufficient space to support activities like outdoor dining, retail displays, again, going back to that, the businesses wanting that additional open space, and any additional planting areas that those businesses may want to provide in front of their businesses, which of course you would want to encourage. Okay, we are going to move on to street cross sections. So as part of the guidelines, we did develop quite a few different cross sections, and these ultimately can be used as guidelines for you all as you are looking to updating any of the roadways within the downtown. And so the first one we're going to talk about was your main street, which essentially is Miracle Strip Parkway. As you all know, this is an 80-foot right-of-way. It's quite a large right-of-way for a downtown area, but we really feel that there are some components we can add to the roadway that will make it a great place for prioritization of circulation and safety, and make it easy to use multimodal type of transportation, including, of course, walking and biking and all the different things that people like to do downtown. And so within this particular cross section, we're showing 12-foot travel lanes, which we would encourage being ultimately, if possible, we understand it's a DOT discussion, but with pavers, 8 feet of parallel parking on both sides, which can ultimately be used for parklets, which are essentially just additional outdoor dining spaces for any restaurants or other businesses you may have downtown. You can also use some of those parallel parking spaces as planters instead of additional parking if you wanted to provide even larger areas for trees and shade of that nature. And then, of course, the 20-foot pedestrian realm that we had just discussed. The two other cross sections that we've provided are for two different, what we call the neighborhood street cross section and for Brook Street. And so these are similar in nature as far as the intent. They do, of course, because they're smaller right-of-ways, they're not going to include quite as large of the pedestrian realm, the 20-foot pedestrian realm. The prototypical neighborhood street cross section shows a 10-foot pedestrian realm, but continues to show the on-street parking as you do have in some areas along the neighborhood streets. And then the Brook Street cross section shows a little bit smaller because, again, you just have a smaller right-of-way in that location with only 50 feet of right-of-way along Brook Street. So we show 5 feet of sidewalk and then on-street parking as well. Stop there because that was a lot of information. Okay, the next thing that we wanted to talk about under public realm is utilities. And we know the city's already starting to do this because we've seen it in many examples, but we just want to continue to build on the work that you all have already done as far as just aiming to minimize that visual impact of how utilities can look sometimes, especially in a public setting in downtowns. And so some of the ways that we can do that is, just avoiding certain placement of them. And so the guidelines do talk about that and where they should be located. Obviously, that's not always something that we can do, but if it can be done, that's helpful. If they have to be somewhere that is very visible, we provide some guidelines on what can be done to sort of screen them or even turn them into art, things like that, just to sort of soften their appearance when they're located downtown. And then last but not least, we talk about activating uses and flexible spaces in the public realm. And so these are your public parks, plazas, and open spaces. And we just talk about how those should be integrated into the downtown fabric, making sure they support walkability, making sure that you can utilize them for numerous different types of uses. So we can, program them for event space, you can use them for public art, you might want to use them for vending or retail opportunities, interactive features, water displays, light shows, whatever it may be. It can be a temporary installation, it doesn't have to be there forever, but just being able to essentially have the flexibility to activate and utilize those public spaces, those open spaces in your downtown. So with that, we're going to move to private realm unless there's any questions.
Just real quick, and maybe this is for Mr. Passetti possibly, but when it shows this cross-section of Miracle Strip Parkway, is that what exists currently as far as the 80 feet?
The width, yes. Now, there's some sections that vary. We talked about that, but that was the general width there. That something, parts of the public realm are obviously longer term with around the mound, and
Right.
it provides direction for a longer range. Some like Brooks, things we can do.
But there's nothing that would need to be done to
Correct. To
remove any buildings
exactly,
or, okay,
exactly.
that's
It was
beautiful.
Showing what we could fit in that.
Just wanted to make certain, that's
Yeah.
really good to hear.
Yeah, and that's a great point, Mayor. We wanted to make sure that these were things you could be doing now or later. So we wanted to make sure that we weren't proposing anything within, especially in the public components of these guidelines, that you can be doing. You can be doing a lot of these things, tomorrow if you wanted to.
Yeah, Mr. Barry.
With those trees and all that, and I'm looking on page 78, it shows that you have something sticking out from the sidewalk into the street.
Yes.
This is Brook Street, correct, that I'm looking at, or is that?
I'm not sure which page
Because,
78 is.
Miracle Strip Parkway is not our, that's state road. We can't have
Right.
anything sticking out.
So in the parallel parking, those planters are actually occurring in the parallel parking spaces. So instead of a parallel parking space, you would skip one parking space and put a tree in instead to provide additional shade. So they're not in the travel lanes or in that area of the
You're
street.
going to take a parking space and plant a tree? You realize
You don't have to, it's just a suggestion.
parking is a premium.
Sure. And it could be at areas where you're approaching an intersection where you're not allowed to put parking because of a viewport issue. You can use them in strategic areas where you wouldn't be able to put parking anyways because of those types of things. It doesn't have to take up like a prime parking location.
Thank you, ma'am. Mr. Davis.
As for your exercise, you have a couple different flavors of what you're going to pitch to the council. Are you including the O&M costs with each one? So including the staff, there's these splash pads, what that's going to...
We didn't get to that detail on cost, but
When we get there, would you present
oh
that?
yes,
There's
of
gonna
course.
be
If you would
budget-
like us to move forward with that part of it, we'd
No,
love
I get it. I just want to make sure
to.
that's thought forward, because we can pick something super cool and then we forget
Yeah,
the
of
staff and
course.
the O&M cost behind it. All right.
Yes, absolutely. If there is anything that you all want to start moving forward on the design side, then yes, we would be able to provide anything like early cost estimates so you all can understand big picture what that looks like.
Thank you.
Not a problem. Okay. So we're going to start with the private realm now, and we're going to talk first about infill and reuse. So infill and reuse, we're talking about really just existing buildings, as well as, you know, possibly vacant lots that are small but between existing buildings. That's really what we're focusing on. So with the infill and reuse guidelines, we're looking at adding to existing buildings or undertaking possibly adaptive uses. So, you know, for instance, something that may have been happening in the movie theater building, you've been using it as a theater for however many years, but you know what? A rock climbing gym came in and they decided that they could use that building for a rock climbing gym. But you don't have that use permitted in the downtown. These are the types of things that we're looking at and encouraging, is essentially saying, okay, well, just because a building was originally built for something, we want to encourage the reuse and adaptive use of these buildings, especially buildings like the movie theater where it's a historic structure, and so that you can keep the building and just change what's happening on the inside of it, and maintaining it for the longevity. And so that also helps celebrate that architecture, the existing architecture, of course, of the building by maintaining it there and just changing a use. It also, you know, we want to, of course, avoid alterations that would damage any of the specific any of the specific characteristics on the building in that way, but we would at least allow for the interiors to be essentially redone to accommodate those adaptive uses. Anyway, I can bring it
Mr.
there.
Berry.
You keep saying interior. Now, CRA has worked with the facade and offered help with the facade, but these buildings do not belong to the city.
Well, I think I can answer that. We're on the private section, so
Oh.
we're talking about what.
Because I'm looking here.
Yeah, we're talking about what private companies might want to do.
Okay, I just
Right.
needed to clarify that.
I apologize. So we're now in private realm. And so these are things that Chris was talking about earlier that could be incentivized to private sector. And so private property owners or developers, when they come in, if they were, for instance, seeking a grant with the CRA, this would be something that we could encourage them. Okay, well, we really love that you're going to be utilizing this building, but we want you to maintain the structure, the historic structure, as far as the facade, on everything you're seeing on the outside, with some leniency on how you could redo the inside of the building to make it work for a different type of use.
So how do you plan to approach a private sector to remodel their inside?
There wouldn't be any approaching them. It would be them approaching the city when they come in for something like a grant or anything else that they're trying to, or that they're trying to gain from the city at this particular point.
Mr. Riley?
In other words, you're basically saying that when they come in, and this is a part of the city criteria would be you're encouraging, right? Not so much as because they are private,
Correct.
but you want to encourage that we preserve quite a few, and specifically on the exterior part, because obviously we want to preserve the history
Right.
of the city. That's one of the things that I'm 100% supportive of, is preserving the historical part of things, but also making sure that the private owner, because that's what they are, private owners, so they should be able to, as long as they meet all the criteria, but also recognize that the city would like for this to occur, if all possible. Is that, am I hearing that?
Yes, so
correctly?
right now, these are, again, just guidelines, and so at this point, there's nothing that is going to require anybody to do these things. They're going to be encouraged and incentivized. And so you all might come up with the CRA might come up with other incentives as far as, requiring some of these guidelines to happen if they want to. But that has not been determined yet, as far as.
Thank you for putting the part on the incentive.
Yes.
Because lots of times people are more willing to work with you when you do give some type of incentive, kind of what's in it for me.
Right.
I got
and
it. Thank you.
We do find, and thank you, we do find that when you are, bringing guidelines into downtown for the first time, that this is really the best way to do it, is to incentivize them, encourage them, find your community champions that want to do these things, and, increase the value of those privately owned structures, so.
Yeah.
Mr. Mayor,
Yes, sir.
while we're here on incentives and privatizing, just want to continue to encourage our staff to do whatever incentives we can look into with the private sector, whether it's our crime and information that happens behind Circle K, and if we can incentivize and try to work on acquisitions and land acquisitions and things to get to a point. I know more on a macro issue is what we're here today, but want to use this time as an opportunity to continue to look for those incentives that we can try to get to one little micro project at a time, so that ultimately, as these guidelines turn into blueprints, we're in a position where we can realistically get to this utopia. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
You got it. Thank you. Ms. Palmer?
Thank you. Okay, so we talked a little bit about the existing buildings. Now we're going to talk about new development as far as architecture specifically for new development. And so some of the things that we talk about in this particular section of the guidelines is that new development should continue to emphasize that unique character of downtown. So just because it's a new building, we want it to still integrate, the general architectural styles and that local vernacular is what we often refer to it. And so we've provided visual examples of what that means, what of course is existing in downtown, as far as being able to integrate the local vernacular, sort of that coastal eclectic style is really what we've captured. And so we've provided guidelines as far as massing, articulation, and materials within those different architectural styles that we feel would really be complementary to the existing buildings downtown. We also talk about building placement. And so again, this will really be more impactful when something is completely redeveloped or, there is a brand new development. But the objection here is to really pay special attention to, again, that placemaking, right? We want to make sure that as far as Main Street is concerned, you want to maintain what we call the optimal street section ratios, and so we have identified what those are in the guidelines for the designers that are working on behalf of any future developers. We've identified what we call the ideal building height at the street. Again, just when you're joining that public realm to private realm, you really want to be seeing that building height of 2 to 3 stories where we have that human scale, so folks aren't looking up at 10 stories right there at the street. We also have encouraged a 10-foot step back, and that is going to happen at the 3rd level. So essentially, if they do decide to go higher than the 2 to 3 stories, they have to set the building back from the street so it doesn't give that tunnel vision essentially as you're coming down Miracle or Brooks, either one. And then we've also recommended, what else is on this one? We talked about the building height. The building height will remain as is as far as the maximum building heights. We're not proposing to change that. It's just, again, the application at the street level. So they would still be able to go up, I think the maximum is 120 feet. Yeah, so they would still be able to go up to 120 feet, but they just wouldn't be able to do that right at the sidewalk. They'd have to set back the building so that it still had that sense of place and pedestrian scale at the street level. And then we also encourage a minimum frontage of 70% at the street, particularly along plazas, courts, alleys, and parks to, again, enhance that pedestrian experience.
I have a question.
Yes.
Is that 120 feet just for downtown along Brook Street? I need clarification.
It's everywhere in the city.
Yes, it's around the city within our MX2 zoning district. So anywhere that there's MX2 zoning, mixed use high, there's an maximum 120 foot.
So how about First Street, between the museum and over in there?
No,
Churches.
some of that area changes to MX1. There's some that's a mix of different zoning there, but not that area specifically. main portions of the corridor downtown, and then like the south side of our Strip Parkway across the street from us here, this general area as well, is MX2.
Okay, so the next section we talk about again with new development is massing. So the massing and the composition of the building should really focus on 3 specific elements: the overall composition, the location of the main volume within the overall composition, and then the location and accentuation of the main entrance into the building. And so that's really what this diagram demonstrates, is essentially showing the higher massing, the 3 stories at a corner, if you're taking up a full block or on a corner parcel, with the 2 stories essentially stepping down mid-block. And the first floor height should fall within the range of 12 to 18 feet, and that's pretty typical for a non-residential or commercial type tenant. As far as design materials, we have provided several visualizations when it comes to paint colors and sidings and the use of brick, shutters, all different types of components from a building materials standpoint, really just making sure that, again, that aesthetic is consistent with what's already within the downtown, as well as consistency with the architectural styles, that coastal vernacular that we're proposing within the guidelines. Then we get into a little bit more detail as far as the different types of components on a facade. I think Councilmember DeBerry had mentioned earlier, what are we talking about as far as what would be required from an architectural facade. Again, this is not requirements. These are just things that we would like to see and encourage within new development that is coming into downtown. And so as you can see, there's different types of articulation that highlighted in the drawings within the guidelines, such as awnings, larger clear glass ratios so that you can see within the businesses. Again, just encouraging those active uses on the first floor, as well as things that are happening on the higher floors. So we want to continue to see those larger window openings and awnings and even balcony and railing components, things of that nature. Coming back to the ground floor, activating ground floor uses. So we're activating ground floor in the public realm, but it's also really important to activate it in the private realm. And so the ways that we encourage that is by ensuring that ground floor is different from the upper facades. We're reinforcing that the public realm streetscape, so essentially providing that seamlessness from the inside of a unit to the outside. Also making sure that the uses that are taking up the space in those first floors are things that the public can use. And so really encouraging retail uses and other commercial uses, and of course dining, whether it's casual or fine dining. But those are the types of things that are going to keep those ground floor uses activated and the main streets continuous to be bringing in folks through the activity that's happening there. We do have a section on accessory structures. Sometimes that is something that is brought to the city as far as wanting to add different types of structures on a property that may not be what we would typically regard as a primary structure. So these are things like gazebos, stages, vendor carts, and kiosks. Again, we just provided some visualization on what we feel would be most consistent with the things that we heard through the public engagement process and the other things that we're suggesting as far as the architectural guidelines. We just want to make sure that they're in scale with everything else, right? You don't want something that's going to stand out and that they're going to be in the right place. And so, we are obviously happy to allow for accessory structures. We just want to make sure that they're consistent and providing an amenity. Private outdoor spaces, this is always one of my favorite sections because I truly feel like sometimes when you have folks come in, they don't really think about the outdoor spaces that they can be sort of using on their private property. And so when they see some of these guidelines and even the visualizations, they seem to get really excited and realize that even though they are not building a building in that place, they can still be using it and encouraging people to use the space on their property. And so we've provided a whole section on that just for the private realm, and it includes things like site furnishings, landscape and hardscape, prioritizing functionality, just showing them how it can be serving different needs of businesses and visitors. Also just ensuring that it doesn't impede access to other nearby public spaces, and designing them to optimize natural light and ventilation, and of course encouraging social interaction, dining, lounging, relaxing, whatever the businesses might want in those open spaces that are in and between and around their businesses. The next section is parking. As you, I'm sure, are aware, this is something that came up quite a bit through our engagement, but we know it is a need no matter what. You want people to use alternative modes of transportation, such as biking and walking, but at the end of the day, we still need to provide for some components of parking. And so at this point, we really looked more at, okay, well, when the parking is going to be provided, how should it look, right? Because again, as far as we know we need parking, but we don't want it to take center stage and essentially take up places within the downtown that can be used for other types of uses. And so we just provided some guidelines on how parking should be provided in both a surface lot environment, street parking environment, and then of course parking structures if that were to be something like that were to be built. And so we of course encourage on-street and existing parking structures to reduce the need for surface lots. Large surface lots like you see in front of Publix are obviously something you don't necessarily want to see downtown. We want to make sure that regardless that all the parking is pedestrian accessible so that they're safe and people can get to where they parked. And that did come up quite a bit again through the engagement process, is making sure that things were easy to get to from wherever they parked to wherever they were going. And so we talked a little bit about that in the guidelines as well. We did have a particular page on the parking structure. Essentially, if somebody were to come in, or even the city, if they were to come in and build a parking structure, how that should look like. Essentially, encouraging ground level facades to really look more like a commercial facade and not just like a parking structure. Encouraging the use of sidewalks again, making sure there's lots of lighting, that it's safe, even providing some examples of how art can be used on the facades of the garages, which is really a dual use. You're getting parking and a public benefit through public art. And encouraging any ground floor non-residential uses, of course, on the first floor if possible. And then lastly, I'm happy to say, we are at our last slide. And so we really want to hear from you. I know you all have been commenting throughout the presentation, but we want to hear what resonated tonight, what concerns or suggestions you might have. Are there any elements you'd like to see changed or revised? That's really what we're looking from you all this evening. And then just before we get to that, the next step eventually would be to, once we address some of the comments that come up tonight or any of the changes, we would of course revise the guidelines, and then the next step would be adopting the guidelines and hopefully starting to identify some projects that you all can work on in the public realm.
Thank you, Ms. Palmer. Questions from the council? Ms. Riley?
I sort of want you to expound a little bit on it. We'll go back to the incentive items for the businesses. Okay, so that's one of my concerns, is to make sure that our local businesses within the city are thriving and flowing, and being patronized. And so, as far as incentive, what sort of incentives would you have in mind? Is it somewhat like tax breaks or something? I mean, what kind of incentive?
Sure. Sure. Yeah, I can probably help add to that some too. As you may or may not know, so we have currently a few different grant programs for SOD grants, development permit fee
Right,
assistance,
right.
and so on. What we've kind of talked about through this process is looking at those programs, those existing grants we have, adding in some criteria requirements to say, hey, look, if you develop in accordance with these guidelines, then we can give you additional grant funding to try and help promote the use of these. I thought of some other. We've kind of talked just conceptually about some other ideas, some other grants to help also. So really, it's using our SARA grant funding that we typically budget, and putting in those requirements that hey, if you go and follow these guidelines, we can help offset financially some of that cost for these improvements. We currently have those grants but there's no requirements. I mean, we've always kind of joked, well, if someone comes in here with some odd color or something off the wall, that is, they may love that maybe not everyone does. There's nothing to say it's, good or bad to anyone. We're not, we couldn't say, well, sorry, we're not going to potentially fund that improvement because it's maybe ugly, in our minds. But with these guidelines, it kind of sets an even standard, saying, hey, if you go with, within here, we can give you some financial support to make those improvements.
Okay, so let me ask you that
Yes.
on the financial support of the grants.
Yes.
What is the cap in terms of how much are we
Sure.
getting the grants? Is it
Currently,
500,000? Is
Right.
it starting at 25,000 and going up to a half mil or a mil
Yeah.
or whatever? What is the?
currently it's 10,000. Now
Okay.
they've changed a lot over the years. That's not set in stone. That's just what they are today. Over the years, 10, 15 years ago, we didn't have a cap on it. It was a first come, first served pot of money, and you use it until it's out. At some point, we lowered it down. Somewhere about 2025. Currently, it's 10. Trying to spread it around. But that's absolutely up to the CRA board, council, and all.
Okay. Thank you.
Anyone else, questions for Ms. Palmer or Mr. Vercetti? Mr. Jeter?
I certainly would agree with Ms. Riley on incentivizing. I think that's the stage we're at. We don't have people, until the bridge gets done and around the mound gets done, we don't have people knocking on our door to overdevelop downtown. We have some vacant buildings we need to incentivize. I think when you were in here presenting a year or so ago and we discussed this, I asked you, how many cities do you think you've done downtown guidelines for in the state of Florida? 10, 20, 50? I'm just saying you're the...
Well, I can answer for me personally. Let's say probably around 10. Our firm has done obviously quite a few.
But your firm is the expert. So what would your firm say that downtown Fort Walton Beach resembles the most of X city? And what did X city do 10 years ago where we are now? We could have a road coming, and that would be great if it does. If the around the mountain happens, then we could do some of these awesome buildings and we could do some of these awesome new roads. If that doesn't happen, what are we left with? So what did a city similar to us do 5 years ago and 10 years ago? Did they just incentivize 50% up to 10 grand? Or did they just use their CRA funds and just splash a big project? Did they, and I'm asking you as the expert, I've been to some pretty cool cities in Florida, but I've obviously done this longer than we have. What do you do from this other than just take this piece of paper? Because here's what I do, and I remember doing this last time. I get excited when I see the pictures, but I get frustrated because how do we make it reality? How do we materialize this and really make it not just a presentation, but tangible? And I'm not saying you have all the answers.
I definitely don't have all the answers, but
But
I can tell you what my experience.
You have other experiences that you can tell us, hey, so-and-so did this. That's how we all learn in this world, right?
Sure.
You learn from your friends, you learn from your neighbors, you learn from what did another city in Florida do that we should be doing that's on this list right now?
So I moved back to the public realm because I will say in my experience, I see that when there's investment in those public realm components, that's when you start seeing activity everywhere else. So I feel that the biggest results are from programming, which I know you all already do a lot of, but really investing in the programming, that you have events and things that you have going on downtown, and then really investing in your public infrastructure, which again goes back to pretty much the whole first half of the document that you're going to be seeing. Is anything that you all can be doing in that public realm, showing that investment is really what seems to communicate to the development community that you all want to see the quality that you're putting in, you want to see happening on the private side as well. And that always, I won't say always, but that tends to be where you start seeing the domino effect of investment on private lands within the downtowns. And of course, I can provide you with more specific examples of that. But
Yeah, I think we talked about a specific city last time. I forget which one you said, but you were going to email us some stuff on. It was a town down in Central Florida that had a road get rerouted and they turned their downtown. I forget the name of the city, but you had one specifically last time. So it'd be cool just to have other ones that we can look at and see what they did 5 or 10 years ago and what we should be doing today to be ahead.
yes, I can bring those emails back up for sure. I don't, my post-40 brain doesn't remember things like that anymore.
Section one on there, I actually attended the tour at a planning conference last year. It was a meeting down there in Pinellas County, down outside of Tampa, St. Peter, that I was really excited and motivated by stuff there because there was a lot of this talking about that they've invested. They were actually rerouting a road, and maybe the one we talked about last year, I can't remember now, but Dunedin was one that if you look at their CRM, what they've done downtown, they even had a city hall. They relocated, redeveloped, beautiful facility, but then they were rerouting their road downtown. They showed us other streetscape improvements and kind of some of those cross-section counter improvements there. And they also have waterfront access to the west side of their downtown. So there was a lot of parallels when I attended that tour there that I thought, through this process, hey, I feel like we're maybe a couple years behind there, but we can get there.
It was Dunedin I remember talking about. I remember saying I've been there 4 or 5 times myself, and they have a place like Brook Street, but they actually had a 12-foot wide abandoned railroad that they were able to turn to a bike path. So now we have a 12-foot bike path coming right over the bridge. Where is that bike path going to go when it gets into Fort Walton? That's the question we've been asking. If there's a bike path that continues to downtown Fort Walton and makes a loop or comes back somewhere, you'll get the people in downtown Fort Walton, because Dunedin has businesses that face one street and then they face the bike path on the other street, and it goes, and it's very similar.
Yeah, it's very well.
So how do we start? Well, that's something we can do right now.
I know we talked to Sun Trail and all, and I know Daniel, well, we're size here, but I know we talked to Daniel about some of that Sun Trail, trying to go after that, to do connections from the island, what they're doing here, and try to continue on through town. So
I like the grants, but if they don't happen, how do we do it? Let's use our CRE funds and do it.
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Jeter. Ms. Riley, you had something?
I guess my question was, have you looked into any best practices in terms of the counties within the state of Florida that are a medium county? Because Okaloosa is like a medium county. So is there any best practices or in terms of, making sure that you're revitalized, renewing, and, developing a city of our size, nature, but I know we have the most beautiful city in the state, of course, but I'm just saying, are there any other cities, medium-sized counties, or focusing on their downtown, and what have they done to really grow their downtown?
Yeah, absolutely. I do want to make sure y'all know that when we put these guidelines together, they're very customized. So we are looking at best practices. I've been talking too much tonight. Specifically for a downtown of this size. We even looked at the actual linear length of the downtown. Some of the things, those very specific components that we have recommended they're all very specific to the size of your downtown, the size of your community. Because we are very clear on the fact that one size does not fit all. And we've seen that work, other cities that are of your size that are using things that would only work in Brickell, Miami, that just would never work in a community like this. So I want to make sure you know that was very specific in our recommendations, is making sure that everything that we're recommending should work in a community, and specifically in a downtown of your size. We did look at a lot of the things that we brought to you during the public engagement process, during our visual preference survey and during some of those stakeholder meetings. And I know that was last year, so a lot of that was But we can bring that back as far as a lot of those, what we call visual preference examples, were pulled from those very similar types of communities that have gone through a similar renaissance that you all are going through right now. And so that was a big part of how we came up with some of these design best practices for these particular guidelines.
Thank you.
I have a question I'd like to ask you as well. You mentioned earlier in the public sector, actually I think right before that, when we were talking about the online respondents and holding the meetings, et cetera, and it read that 50% of respondents would like to see a structured parking garage. Now, I know you're probably not going to have a very specific example of this, as Mr. Jeter, I think, beautifully brought up earlier, but you are the expert on things like this. So, for example, say the community really wants a parking garage. It's a constant complaint that we've all heard when we have events downtown, when we do hold that programming, that we're trying to bring people downtown. We're trying to bring people from not only out of town, but our surrounding cities and from our own city to enjoy an event. And, you know, we're moving trash cans and trying to figure out parking as best we can. We've made certainly like some advances in that. We have another parking area that's coming here pretty soon, hopefully. But if it were to be something that we decided, that our council decided, hey, we're going to build our own city parking garage right in the middle of downtown. Obviously, the aesthetics are not great. I saw that you had made some ways to make it look a little fancier, etc. But in your opinion, a parking garage, would that be something that would incentivize businesses, developers, and residents to visit downtown more often?
I definitely think that a parking structure, if it was a public parking structure, could incentivize private development. If especially possibly residential development. I mean, one of the big things that we see in a lot of our communities that are essentially, you know, limited on their land areas is that you have these, as we identified in your downtown, you have all these small lots and you just don't have space to build. If you're going to redevelop or build new, you don't have the space to put parking. And so one of the big things that we've worked with a lot of our communities on is providing for essentially a pay-in-lieu program, right? So that they don't have to park or provide parking on their particular lot. Because even if you change the parking regs and say you don't need to provide parking, the reality is that if somebody's coming in and building a brand new building, they want to have parking within proximity of their use, and so especially for residential. And so, yes, to answer your question, that is a great way to incentivize redevelopment and development, is by doing some sort of parking in lieu program. It doesn't have to necessarily start as a parking structure. It could start, I did a lot of work for the town of Jupiter down in Palm Beach County. We started in the CRA in the Inlet Village district with a surface parking lot. And so they owned the parcel and they provided surface parking in the beginning. And then once enough interest came in, they finally were able to build the parking structure over time once they were able to collect enough fees to do so. And so those fees went to the parking structure, as well as they also have a program with retail tenants, especially the restaurants right on the inlet, that really need, you know, more parking than what even the code requires, and so they can also rent parking in those parking structures as well, and that is something that the city just collects fees on. So,
gotcha. If I could follow up just with a question for Mr. Davis and Mr. Frasetti. And again, this is just, we're in this meeting, we're throwing out ideas, we're talking about possibilities. Are there any lots, especially city-owned lots? You know, for example, my mind keeps going to the lot right there at Flora Blanca, where the city owns that lot right next to the museum. And I know it's not a huge lot, but at the same time, if we're talking about buildings that could potentially be 120 feet, you know, you don't have to go up 120 feet to get some pretty significant parking in a structure like that. Would that lot be feasible, or are there other lots within this downtown overlay that the city either owns now or are vacant and abandoned that would be potential for a parking structure like that?
Actually, we were just looking at that lot yesterday. We were down there talking about, you know, potential for that property. If you may recall, when we first purchased that property, back probably 10 or so years ago, working with Daniel and his side on the engineering side, we did do some preliminary parking lot layout plans for it. We put those on hold. So, there's something there, logistics-wise, space-wise, we have to see. We've also talked to public-private partnerships or some other better, higher use potentially for that property. As you probably recall too, the former proposal for the Landmark Center, their property, part of that was a development agreement with the city to look at the property kind of behind Salty Duck and Concord and all there. We have a city parking lot there now. There were previously plans drawn up, kind of from the private sector there, the Department of the City to do a structure. That's, interior of a block there that the city, controls a good chunk of in the center. So I think that can be a great opportunity in there, especially in the downtown area. In the downtown master plan, the conceptual, 50,000 foot level of it was to look at doing the parking structures kind of the outskirts of downtown, the center core, kind of by the library, by the other big property in the museum, just having those kind of public spaces and uses and, maybe some relocations of things, but, that property, behind Fockers there, Landmark is probably a good one that, we do have, we control today, we could, do something on. Others would probably have, acquisitions, we don't have, or some of these parcels, like Ally mentioned kind of early on, and it makes it a little tough on that side.
Sure. Understandable. Thank you. Mr. Jeter.
While we're on parking, is the parking next to the landing still progressing? Is Daniel Payne on that, or?
Daniel will need to be here to give you the latest on that. Last I know, they had torn a building down a couple weeks ago, finally. I remember seeing some email traffic text from him on that, Kim Barnes.
That sounds like progress.
So it's still progressing?
Correct, that's the extent that I know, I'm sorry. That's right, what the other Kim? Kim's right.
Mr. Berry?
Yeah, the parcel on Perry and 98, about 10 years or so ago, they were talking about parking garage there also. Whatever happened to that? Just fell through.
Yes, that original project and ownership fell through. The current owners of that parcel, they kind of took the idea of the Landmark Center and kind of carried it forward into their own kind of revised version of it, but still kind of hotel mixed-use property. They stay in contact with me and our planning team every few months or so. They reach out, kind of see where things are progressing between the bridge, around the mound. The latest I heard a few months ago was that they were still considering and planning. They were still planning to do the project, potentially starting the hotel at phase 1. That they could even fit wholly on their property, not needing kind of some city space and city property, but then kind of have the phase eventually come to the city like Landmark did. So that they still say they're okay to move forward in the future. So we're still here, ready, and it will help.
Anyone else?
I'm on parking too. Looking at what we're doing, do we have like a goal? Is there a number? I know we talk about curbside. I think it's good, obviously, to spread it out and then one big structure. But looking at the size of what we're doing, is there like, we need to create X amount of spaces? Like, is there that prime number? Or we haven't?
We didn't come up with an exact number for this particular project, just because we don't know necessarily what the future development's going to look like. What we did do is show where parking is possible within the public right-of-way. And so essentially, if you're going to be doing improvements, these are areas where you can identify additional public parking.
Okay.
And to add to that too, so in the downtown master plan, that was worked on a couple of years ago, there's numbers, in that process we went through the different types of uses, and they did a conceptual pro forma to look at some of the number of different types of uses, residential, retail, commercial, different things. And in there's square footages that I know when we kind of initially looked at even some more intensity numbers with the MX3 is, between me and my planning team, we went through and said, okay, well here's, to make the numbers work that they did, here's the intensity that we would need. So we actually have numbers of between square footage and things that we can tie back to parking numbers. So we do have some conceptual numbers there in the downtown master plan, really track parking.
And does the city own that Brooks and Perry, where the construction guys are right now? They've re-asphalted it a bunch of times. They park the heavy machinery there, right there, across from the Northwest Florida Ballet.
No, we don't. We were in a ground lease. We did the public parking improvements there years ago. We worked with the owners, but it was just a lease deal. So that lease, obviously, DOT came in, acquired portions of their property there. That's where we got the park and all that now there. There were some discussions with previous city managers years back that, once the project is all said and done, we may see some of that return back to us. Somewhat in flux right now, but we owned the old Birchbridge Barbecue, which is one parcel over. That was city owned. Transferred some of the DOT over there, and the property right at the corner was privately owned. And that's where we had those discussions. Maybe we would get some of it back in the future.
So there's some potential.
We're hoping. Yeah, and, initially they were talking about doing some stormwater retention for the bridge years ago, but it turned out, that was elsewhere. So maybe we could have some space back there, in the future.
Councilman Schmidt.
Piggyback off of this park and train, and also to piggyback off what Councilman Jeter mentioned, about 7 or 8 years ago, we hired a strategic planner that produced a product that is in a neighboring town or close town out of Pensacola, So kind of push back on the parking conversation, the narrative, so that I know we're in the very early phases in the guidelines, but just to try to bring some hopeful clarity maybe to staff, but also too as we develop these parking conversations, that whether it's Alice Beach, 30A, or for Walton Beach, the potential that we all believe up here with the optimism of people going to be a destination location, of coming here with the 12-foot sidewalks that's going to connect the Gulf into the downtown and those kind of things, that we just caution ourselves on trying to meet a parking need with building a whole bunch of parking garages. But necessarily how we build the parking garages, I think, is more of the question of how we build them. The PPPs and the public-private partnerships and those kind of things that we can, try to work towards meeting a need of parking. But whether it's, again, New Orleans density or our density that is here and continuing to come, if we build multiple structures, there will always be a conversation 20 years from now, how do we build more? Without giving up that nostalgic, that historic, those brands that we need to continue to preserve while still planning for the growth, all this fun stuff that I can nerd out on with y'all too. But in the sense of parking, let's just be very cautious on trying to meet the data needs while without losing that nostalgia that we heard presented today that's very, very valuable. So that's all I got, Mr. Mayor. Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else questions? Seeing none, if you have any final statements or anything you'd like to say, or no? Well, thank you very much for being here. It was a wonderful presentation, and obviously we have this in front of us, and our council can see how we move forward with it. Mr. Vercetti?
Yeah, so that kind of ends there. Thank you all again. And so, next steps, time, looking at just kind of where we go from here with the effort. I know I believe we have attached the actual document to this that you can all view, independently, individually. I think timing-wise, summer here, council schedules and all is probably a good time that, if you all have any questions, comments after this meeting that you may think of, or review the document, we'd love to hear any additional feedback, and then, we can kind of collect that, try to, if there's any revisions here, say through July, even, into July, since we're all for council meetings, then we can try and maybe regroup as a more finalized version of it for August, and see about implementing it kind of based on the incentive side and the public sector side for things to prioritize, and then we can get going.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
And thank you again, Ms. Palmer. All right, we will adjourn.